CEO happens to catch his young housemaid secretly taking leftover food to a little boy. Curiosity drives him to disguise himself and follow the boy, only to discover the boy is her younger brother living with their ailing mother in a crumbling house. The next morning, when he calls her into his study, something happens that will change her life forever. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. The night air carried the damp, cool scent of an early autumn rain, the kind that never came down in sheets but lingered in a fine mist, settling on everything it touched. A thin drizzle clung to the polished hood of the black Mercedes as it pulled quietly into the private driveway, its headlights cutting long beams through the gold-tinted fog. The street was silent except for the low hum of distant traffic and the occasional hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Rows of ornate street lamps cast warm halos onto the brick pavement, each circle of light reflecting off the slick stones like ripples of molten amber. Inside the car, Richard Holloway gripped the steering wheel with the casual confidence of a man who'd done this drive thousands of times. But tonight he was later than usual. The weight of an extended board meeting still sat heavy in his shoulders. At 53, with silver threading his temples and a reputation built on calculated decisiveness, Richard was used to controlling every variable in his world. Yet as he eased the car to a stop and the engine quieted, something about the silence felt different. He stepped out, the drizzle beating on his tailored overcoat. The wrought iron gates loomed ahead, their intricate curves black against the gold light. As the automatic latch clicked open, Richard glanced toward the side path, a place he rarely paid attention to. Tonight his gaze caught movement. There, just beyond the hedge, stood Maya. She was only 23, the youngest of his household staff. Normally cheerful, with a quiet grace in her movements, she now looked like a shadow trying not to be seen. Her dark hair, damp from the mist, clung in soft waves around her face. She held a plain paper bag close to her chest, glancing left and right as though afraid of being caught. Richard slowed his steps, letting the rhythm of his shoes on the wet stone blend into the rain. He watched as Maya moved to the back gate, the one leading out to the service alley. From the darkness emerged a figure, a boy, no older than 12. Thin to the point of fragility, his jacket hung from his shoulders like it belonged to someone twice his size. The fabric was worn thin, the cuffs frayed. His sneakers were caked with dried mud, the laces knotted together in mismatched lengths. Maya knelt down slightly so her eyes met his, her voice barely audible over the patter of drizzle. Richard couldn't hear the words, but he saw the faint curve of her lips in a smile that was gentle, almost sisterly, though shadowed by something worry, perhaps, or guilt. She pulled the bag open just enough to show him what was inside. The boy's eyes lit up for a brief, fleeting moment. They spoke softly, the boy's hands tightening around the bag as if it were treasure. Then, as quickly as it began, the exchange ended. Maya gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping back. The boy turned and disappeared into the narrow darkness of the alley without looking back. Richard stood there for a moment longer, the scene settling into his mind like a drop of ink spreading through water. He continued inside, the warmth of the marble foyer doing little to cut through the chill that had taken root in his chest. By habit, he climbed the grand staircase to his private quarters. The house was still, the kind of stillness that came only after every servant had retired for the night. Yet his thoughts kept circling back to what he'd just seen. The paper bag, the boy's eyes, the way Maya's shoulders had dropped in relief when the food left her hands. He shrugged off his coat and crossed to his desk, where the sleek monitor for the home's security system rested. A part of him told himself he was only curious. Another part, the one honed over decades of business negotiations, told him there was more here than met the eye. Richard keyed in the access code and pulled up the camera feeds. The soft glow of the screen painted his face in pale blue as he rewound the footage from the rear gate. He watched the grainy image of tonight's exchange replay before his eyes. Then he kept scrolling backward through previous nights. What he found made his pulse quicken. The same scene, almost identical, played out again and again. Maya, the bag, the boy. Night after night. Always at the same hour, always at the same gate. The only variation was the clothing they wore, sometimes dry, sometimes damp from rain. But the ritual never changed. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. 100 questions crowded his thoughts at once. Who was the boy? Why had Maya never mentioned him? And why did she have to be so secretive, slipping food from a house where nothing was ever in short supply? The quiet hum of the monitor was the only sound in the room now, but Richard's mind was anything but calm. Somewhere in the folds of this nightly ritual was a truth he had not been invited to know, and that fact alone unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Tonight curiosity had taken root. Tomorrow he knew it would demand answers. The following night, the air felt sharper, the cold sliding down the narrow alley behind the mansion like a blade. The streetlights from the main road didn't reach here, only a faint wash of amber spilled from the rear service door, casting long, uneasy shadows on the cracked pavement. Richard stood in the darkness near the corner, leaning slightly against the damp brick wall. Gone was the crisp overcoat and polished shoes. Tonight his body was draped in a tattered army green jacket, its elbows frayed and darkened with grime. A tangled mass of fake whiskers clung to his jaw, the adhesive itching against his skin. His trousers hung loose, the fabric stiff with age, and a mismatched pair of gloves covered his hands. He had studied himself in the mirror earlier, and found the transformation convincing enough to vanish into the night as nothing more than a man down on his luck. The wind tunneled between the buildings, carrying with it the metallic scent of rain-soaked concrete. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then fell silent. He kept his gaze fixed on the small rear gate, the same one he had seen on the security footage. The seconds stretched, his breath rising in pale wisps. Every faint sound sharpened his senses, the rattle of a loose shutter, the distant hum of an idling truck, the whisper of leaves brushing against the fence. Then, just as he began to wonder if she would come at all, Maya appeared. Her figure emerged from the glow of the service light, her dark hair pulled back into a loose bun, a thick cardigan wrapped around her narrow shoulders. She glanced behind her once, quick but deliberate, before stepping through the gate. In her hands, another plain paper bag, its bottom sagging slightly under the weight. From the shadow, Richard's heart gave a single hard thump. He pressed his shoulder deeper into the wall, keeping his head lowered. Moments later, the boy appeared, darting out from the mouth of the alley. His breath came fast, his hands jammed into the pockets of his thin jacket, as if to keep them warm. They met halfway between the gate and the alley's end, just as they had the night before. Maya bent slightly, speaking to him in a voice too low for Richard to hear. The boy nodded quickly, his gaze darting toward the street beyond. She reached into the bag, shifting items to make it easier for him to hold, then placed it gently into his arms. His small fingers tightened instantly around it, knuckles pale against the brown paper. Richard stepped forward. Not too close, not too fast, but enough to be noticed. The crunch of his shoes on the grit drew their attention at once. Maya's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing as she took in his ragged frame. The boy stiffened, pulling the bag closer to his chest like a shield. "Evening," Richard said, pitching his voice low and rough, the way he imagined a man used to begging might sound. "I don't mean to intrude," but he nodded toward the bag. "Could you spare a little for someone who hasn't eaten in a while?" For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then, without hesitation, Maya reached in and pulled out a small wrapped sandwich, placing it gently into his outstretched hand. Her eyes softened, but her expression held no pity, only quiet resolve. "Here," she said simply. "Eat while it's still warm." The boy shifted uneasily, his gaze flicking between Maya and the stranger before him. Richard let his fingers close around the sandwich, feeling its slight warmth seep into his cold skin. "Thank you," he murmured, studying her face, the calm in her eyes despite the situation. "Is he your brother?" The question slipped out, more probing than he'd intended. The boy's head lifted sharply, and for an instant, Richard saw a flash of something fear, or perhaps defiance. "Yes," Maya answered quietly, before he could speak, her tone final, leaving no room for further questions. Richard opened his mouth to press, but the boy was already moving. Without a word, he turned and sprinted down the alley, the paper bag thumping softly against his side. Maya called after him once, her voice a mix of warning and care, but he didn't stop. His footsteps faded quickly into the maze of narrow streets. Richard stood there, the sandwich in his hand growing cooler by the second. The wind picked up again, tugging at the hem of his jacket. Maya's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, as though weighing whether to say something more, then she simply turned back toward the gate. She slipped inside without another word, the lock clicking softly behind her. Alone now, Richard looked toward the alley where the boy had vanished, his mind churning with questions. The secrecy hung heavy in the air, more tangible than the cold, and he found himself no closer to understanding why this ritual was hidden from him, only more certain that it was. The following evening, the sky hung low and heavy, the last threads of daylight bleeding into the horizon as the sun surrendered to night. A faint haze clung to the streets, curling in the corners of narrow alleys like smoke reluctant to leave. Richard stood across from the alley entrance, where he had seen the boy disappear the night before. He was dressed again in the same tattered jacket, his beard roughened with a fresh layer of grime. The cold bit through the thin fabric, but he hardly noticed. His eyes were fixed on the small figure that emerged from the shadows. There he was, the boy walking with the hurried steps of someone who knew the way home by heart. Richard let him get a small lead before following. The soles of his worn shoes scraped quietly over the uneven pavement, every sound amplified in the silence between the walls. The alley narrowed, then bent sharply, revealing a warren of back streets that twisted away from the orderly symmetry of the wealthy neighborhoods. Street lamps here were sparse, some cracked, others dead entirely, leaving long pools of darkness that swallowed sound. The air smelled faintly of rust and damp wood. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried briefly before the sound was smothered by a tired voice. The boy moved quickly, weaving through a labyrinth of passageways, his small shoulders hunched against the evening chill. Richard kept his distance, careful to remain a shadow among shadows. The world here felt closer, heavier, walls pressed in, roofs leaned toward each other, as though conspiring to keep out the light. There was no marble here, no polished brass or manicured hedges. Instead, doors were patched with plywood, windows covered in thin blankets that barely held back the cold. After several turns, the boy slowed. Ahead stood a small weather-beaten house crouched at the end of a narrow lane. Its siding was warped, paint long surrendered to peeling gray. The front steps sagged, their wood splintered and soft from years of rain. A single window cast a faint flickering glow from somewhere inside. The boy glanced behind him once, but Richard had already melted into the darkness beside a leaning fence. The boy pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. Richard inched closer, careful not to let the loose boards underfoot betray him. Through the crack of the door, and a broken slat in the wall, he could see the interior, a single room, cramped and dimly lit by a lamp whose shade leaned precariously to one side. The air inside looked cold despite the light, the kind of cold that seeped in when there was no proper heat to push it back. Against the far wall stood a narrow bed. On it lay a woman, her skin a shade paler than it should have been, her breath shallow and uneven. Her hair, streaked with gray, framed a face lined not just by age but by hardship. She turned her head slightly toward the sound of the boy's footsteps, her lips pulling into the faintest smile. He set the paper bag gently on a rickety table beside her and began unpacking the contents: pieces of bread, a container of stew, a handful of apples that still held a sheen of refrigerator chill. Richard watched as the boy moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of routine. He fetched a cup from a shelf and filled it with water from a plastic jug, then held it carefully to the woman's lips. She sipped, her hand trembling slightly as it rested on his wrist. There was no chatter, no small talk. Their silence was not empty, it was filled with understanding born of necessity. The room was sparse, a single chair sat near the bed, its cushion torn open to reveal yellowed stuffing. A stack of folded clothes served as a makeshift pillow on the floor, next to a thin blanket. There was no smell of fresh cooking here, only the faint scent of damp fabric and the tang of the food Maya had sent home. Richard's gaze lingered on the boy's face as he handed his mother a small piece of bread, his eyes fixed on her as though willing her to take one more bite. In those eyes, Richard saw more than fatigue, he saw the kind of guarded hope that came from living one day at a time. The woman murmured something, her voice so soft it barely reached the boy's ears. He smiled faintly in response, brushing a stray hair from her forehead with the back of his hand. For a moment, the lines of worry in his young face eased, then he turned toward the table, dividing the rest of the food into small portions, as if making it last was second nature to him. Richard felt a weight settle in his chest, heavier than the damp air. The image of his own kitchen flashed in his mind, gleaming countertops, stocked refrigerators, untouched platters of food, discarded after dinner parties. The contrast was so stark it almost hurt to hold in his thoughts. He shifted slightly, the cold from the fence pressing into his back, and realized his hands had clenched into fists inside his gloves. He hadn't expected this. He had thought perhaps the boy lived with friends, or in some shelter, not here in a house that seemed to bend under the weight of its own decay. He hadn't expected to see the quiet dignity with which they navigated their hardship, or the fierce tenderness in the way the boy cared for his mother. The minutes stretched on. The boy sat in the chair, his elbows resting on his knees, watching over her as she drifted into a restless sleep. Her breathing was uneven, but when her hand slid off the blanket, he reached over quickly to tuck it back in. Richard's breath fogged in the air as he stepped back from the wall. The scene behind it burned into his memory. There was nothing here of malice or deceit, only necessity, only love wrapped in secrecy because perhaps pride or fear made it so. Yet the secrecy gnawed at him, raising questions about how long they had lived like this, and how many times Maya had quietly filled that paper bag, knowing it might be the difference between her family eating or going hungry. As he turned to leave, the narrow street seemed even darker than before, the cold sharper, the space between the mansion on the hill and this little house stretching into something immeasurable. He walked away slowly, his footsteps echoing in the stillness, carrying with him not just the image of poverty, but the unshakable sense that he had stepped into a world he had never truly seen, one that existed parallel to his own, separated by nothing more than the width of a city, yet by every measure of life, a world apart. The night had deepened into a stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. The narrow street lay deserted, the shadows settling heavy against the cracked walls. Overhead the moon had climbed high enough to angle a pale beam through the single, uncurtained window of the small house. That light spilled across the worn floorboards and over the bed where the woman lay, her shallow breaths rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. Richard stood just beyond the weathered doorframe, his back against the warped siding, leaning close enough to see through the thin gap where the door failed to meet the jamb. Inside, the boy sat in the same chair as before, his elbows on his knees, chin resting in his small hands. His gaze never left his mother, the kind of gaze that carried both worry and a watchfulness beyond his years. The paper bag from earlier was gone, the contents already portioned out and tucked away, though Richard knew there couldn't have been much to save. The air inside was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the house settling and the whisper of the wind sneaking through the window frame. Richard's eyes shifted, catching the faint glint of a family photograph balanced on the edge of a shelf. Even from where he stood, he recognized Maya's smile in the picture, open, warm, but also saw something in her eyes that he had missed before. He thought back to the mornings when she greeted him at the kitchen door, her voice light and her hands already busy with the day's work. She had smiled then too, but now he could see the truth hiding behind it, a quiet heaviness, an unspoken urgency she carried alone. He felt a tightness in his chest as the moments aligned in his mind like links in a chain. Every polite nod, every time she refused to take leftovers for herself, every quick glance at the clock before slipping away for the evening, it was all part of the same unbroken line leading here. She had been feeding her family from the scraps of his abundance, walking the thin edge between compassion and risk. If anyone in his world had noticed or complained, she could have lost the only income holding this fragile home together. The thought made him draw a slow, measured breath. In his world, problems were challenges to be solved, negotiations to win, markets to influence, deals to close. But this wasn't a boardroom problem. This was the kind of truth that stayed with you, the kind that rewrote the way you looked at people, even those you thought you knew. The boy reached forward, adjusting the blanket over his mother's shoulders. The motion was small, almost careful enough to be missed, but it hit Richard harder than any grand gesture could have. There was no complaint in the boy's face, no sign of resentment, only a kind of steady, unyielding care that made the edges of Richard's own certainty feel softer, less defined. He stepped back from the door, the boards under his feet groaning in quiet protest. The night air wrapped cold around him. As he moved away from the house, each step deliberate, slow, he didn't want them to know he had been there. This wasn't a moment to be interrupted, and it wasn't his place to take it from them. At the corner of the lane, he paused and glanced back. The window still glowed faintly, the thin slice of moonlight crossing the room like a fragile bridge between the inside and the outside. He thought about the unspoken rules of the world he lived in, where wealth was meant to insulate and separate. Yet here he was, feeling the sharp pull of something that had nothing to do with business or propriety. The injustice of it pressed at him, the distance between his reality and theirs, the sheer imbalance that allowed one house to waste what another needed to survive. He could feel a stir of resolve beneath the weight of his thoughts, though it came tangled with a strange helplessness. There was no quick fix for this, no simple act that could erase the years that had led to this moment. He turned away fully now, the sound of his own footsteps the only noise in the sleeping street. Above him, the moon sailed on, indifferent to the quiet dramas unfolding below. Richard's mind was restless, but somewhere beneath the unease, a faint warmth had begun to grow, a recognition that perhaps the measure of a man wasn't only in what he built, but in how he chose to see, and what he chose to do once he had seen. Morning broke clear and bright, the city's usual haze swept aside by a crisp autumn sun. Light poured through the wide glass windows of Richard's corner office, spilling across the polished mahogany desk and glinting off the brass trim of his nameplate. He sat in his high-backed leather chair, the weight of the previous night still heavy in his thoughts. His tie lay loose against his collar, the top button undone, as though even the formality of his usual armor felt unnecessary this morning. The city below moved in orderly patterns, cars filing neatly along the avenues, pedestrians crossing in measured streams, but inside the office, time seemed to slow. On the desk before him sat a freshly printed employment contract, the ink still smelling faintly of toner. Beside it lay a crisp white envelope holding a check, the numbers written in steady, deliberate strokes. Another folder lay open, containing the paperwork for a private medical assistance plan, and next to that, a letter to the principal of a small local school, arrangements for a scholarship that would bear no signature, no traceable generosity. He had spent the early hours putting each detail into place, his pen moving with the same precision he brought to business, but for a purpose entirely different. He thought of Maya's steady hands, the way she had placed food into her brother's arms without hesitation. He thought of the boy's careful watch over his mother, of the quiet resilience inside that small dimly lit room. And with each image came the simple truth that he could change the course of their days, not by charity wrapped in spectacle, but by giving them the means to stand on steadier ground. Richard leaned back for a moment, letting the sunlight warm his face. The decision felt right, solid, like the final move in a long and careful game. There was no need for her to know how much he had seen, or how deeply it had stirred him. The gift was not for gratitude, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had acted. Later that day, Maya was called into the small administrative office off the main hall of the mansion. She entered cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her, uncertain why she had been summoned. The house manager handed her a sealed envelope, her expression unreadable. Maya thanked her softly before stepping outside to open it. The sunlight caught the edge of the paper as she unfolded it. At first her brow furrowed in confusion, then her breath caught. Her eyes moved over the words: a salary increase well beyond anything she had imagined, a comprehensive medical plan that would begin immediately, and a brief note that simply read, "For your continued dedication and the value you bring, both seen and unseen." Tucked behind the letter was the check, enough to erase the debts she had quietly carried for years. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her vision blurring as the weight of relief flooded her. Her first thought was of her mother, the medications they could now afford, the warmth they could bring into their home before winter tightened its grip. Then she thought of her brother, the schoolbooks he had wanted, the doors that could open for him now. She felt the sharp edge of gratitude, but also something steadier, hope firm and unexpected, rooting itself deep. When she stepped back into the main corridor, Richard was there, leaning casually against the doorframe of his office. He wasn't in his chair, wasn't behind the desk that usually separated him from the rest of the world. Their eyes met. He didn't speak, and neither did she. He simply offered a small, genuine smile, his gaze steady, his presence quiet but certain. Maya nodded once, her throat too tight for words, and in that moment, the understanding passed between them without a syllable spoken. She turned to leave, her steps lighter than when she had come in, the envelope held close against her chest. Richard watched her go, the corners of his mouth still curved in that faint, unassuming smile. He returned to his office, the city stretching out before him, its noise and ambition moving on as always. But somewhere in that expanse, a small house would soon be warmer, a woman's breath would come easier, and a boy's future would carry more light than shadow. Winter came early that year, but the little house at the end of the narrow lane no longer felt like a place bracing against the cold. A new coat of paint brightened its weathered walls, the front steps repaired so they no longer groaned underfoot. Inside, the air carried the comforting scent of simmering soup, the kind that lingered in the corners and made the whole space feel alive. Maya's mother rested in a proper bed now, her breathing steadier, her cheeks carrying back some of the color that illness had taken. The boy sat at the table, his schoolbook spread out before him, the clean pages marked with fresh ink from pencils that no longer needed to be borrowed. Maya moved between the stove and the table with a quiet her laughter breaking through the small rooms like sunlight through open curtains. There was no trace of the secrecy and strain that had once marked their nights. In its place was a steadiness, a rhythm of life shaped by possibility. And though they never spoke of where the turning point began, each of them carried an unspoken understanding that somewhere beyond their walls, someone had chosen to see them, and in doing so had changed everything.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.